Welcome to session 3. Last week you will have arranged meeting with your supervisors. In those meetings you would have discussed the population, intervention, comparator outcome and study designs. You will have taken those relevant reviews to that meeting and discussed them with your supervisor. You will have clarified what your review will add and explained why it is necessary. You'd have considered the mechanism, the effect of any interventions that you're reviewing on outcome. You'd have considered iterations that you could undertake of your search question and decided on a final configuration of your review question and PICOs. And you'd have checked that you'd found all the reviews that your supervisor expected to see. So in terms of the overall structure of the module, we're still in the formatting the question and search based on PICOs section, and we're just starting to do some of the retrieving. Today we're going to run searches in PubMed and Central, and we're going to retrieve those into Endnote Online. So in terms of the learning objectives, you're still in the section where you're formulating a question, developing search terms based on the PICOs framework. This week, as I said, we're going to be working up those search terms. We're going to be building the modular strategy using established terms from existing reviews. We're going to be learning about search operators and subject headings, and we're going to learn to use Ovid Medline rather than PubMed. I'm going to give you a worked example of doing all this so that you've got something to follow, and we're going to look at the press checklist so you guys can peer review each other's searches. Finally, we're going to look at exporting from both Central and PubMed into Endnote Web. So hopefully you all feel confident in searching PubMed after last week and able to search the Cochrane library or the Cochrane database for systematic reviews for relevant Cochrane reviews. And you feel clear now about where your review would sit amongst the reviews that you've found, and you'll be clear about what your review adds. Finally, if you haven't already, you should have iterated your PICOs so that you now feel like there is space for your review. So in terms of how explicit you need your PICOs to be, Item 4 of the PRISMA reporting guidelines, which we'll talk about more in coming weeks, gives guidance on how to provide an explicit statement of the objectives or questions a review addresses. And it says, an explicit and concise statement of the review objective or objectives and or questions will help readers understand the scope of the review and assess whether the methods used in the review, such as eligibility criteria, search methods, data items, and the comparisons used in the synthesis, adequately address the objectives. Such statements may be written in the form of objectives. For example, the objectives of the review were to examine the effects of, or as questions, what are the effects of? The essential elements are that you must provide an explicit statement of all objectives or questions that the review addresses, expressed in terms of a relevant question formation framework. If the purpose is to evaluate the effects of interventions, use the population intervention comparator outcome framework or one of its variants to state the comparisons that will be made. So, from a review that I'm interested in, the effects of exercise training for bronchiectasis, their statement, or rather their explicit statement of the objectives is as follows. To determine effects of exercise training compared to usual care on exercise tolerance, that's the primary outcome. Quality of life, that's another primary outcome. Incidence of acute exacerbations and hospitalizations. Respiratory and mental health symptoms, physical function, mortality, and adverse events in people with stable or acute exacerbation of bronchiectasis. Fingers crossed I get through this term without one. So we mentioned there frameworks that can be used to state the objectives. And there's some guidance in a paper by Munn et al. And the paper's entitled, "What kind of systematic review should I conduct? A proposed typology and guidance for systematic reviews in the medical and health sciences." And what that does is it sets out a series of types of reviews that you can undertake and describes the different frameworks that you can use to answer those. So we're mostly in this module doing effectiveness reviews. We're mostly reviewing studies of whether or not something is effective at changing something else. But if you feel that PICO isn't a good way to break up your question, there are other options. So for example, if you're doing an experiential review, so a review to investigate the experience or meaningfulness of a particular phenomenon, you might look at population, phenomena of interest, or context. So for example, what is the experience of undergoing high technology medical imaging, such as MRI, in adult patients in high income countries? There, the phenomenon of interest is the experience, event, or process that's under study, and the context will vary depending on the objective of the review. So it may include consideration of cultural factors such as geographic location, specific racial or gender-based interests, or details about the setting. Reviews assessing experience of a phenomenon may use mixed methods approaches and may include quantitative data such as surveys. There are reporting guidelines available for qualitative reviews that should be made use of, such as the NTREC statements, that's enhancing transparency in the reporting of syntheses of qualitative research. Another type of review is risk reviews. So these might be to determine the association between particular exposures or risk factors and particular outcomes. So there, instead of PICOS, you have population exposure outcome. So an example might be, what are the challenges for females with high functioning autism in a workplace? A systematic review. So here, the review should outline the exposure, disease, symptom, or health condition of interest, the population or group at risk, as well as the context or location, the time period, and the length of time where these are relevant. The exposure of interest refers to the particular risk factor associated with a condition of interest in a group. It should be clearly reported what the exposure or condition is and how it might be measured or identified, and important outcomes of interest relevant to the issue and relevant to key stakeholders should be specified. So here, in addition to the PRISMA guidelines that I'm going to go into detail for you, there are other guidelines called the Meta-Analysis of Observational Studies in Epidemiology Reporting Guidelines, or MOOS for short. Essentially what we're looking for is really explicit inclusion-exclusion criteria. So we need to specify the criteria used to decide what evidence was eligible or ineligible in sufficient detail that it will enable readers to understand the scope of review and verify the inclusion-exclusion decisions. So the essential elements are that we specify all study characteristics used to decide whether the study was eligible for inclusion in the review. That is, components described in the PICO frameworks. How detailed might that be? Well, here's the description from the exercise for training for bronchiectasis review that I keep mentioning. So, just in terms of the participants, here's how they specified it. We included people of any age with a diagnosis of bronchiectasis according to high-resolution computed tomography or physician diagnosis. Studies comprising patient groups of mixed respiratory pathology must include at least 75% with a primary diagnosis of bronchiectasis or available data on a bronchiectasis subgroup. No participants were excluded on the basis of coexisting respiratory disease, e.g. COPD. However, people with bronchiectasis due to cystic fibrosis were not eligible for inclusion. Participants were eligible for inclusion irrespective of whether they were experiencing an acute exacerbation of their bronchiectasis or whether they were in a period of disease stability. And thank goodness I'm in a long period of disease stability. So we've got our PICOS set out, it's really explicit, we know what we're going to include, we know what we're not going to include. How do we then work from there to having a set of search terms? So we've got our PICO elements now, and we want to work towards building a search strategy. We can draw on an approach from Bramer et al. In 2018 in a paper, A Systematic Approach to Searching, an Efficient and Complete Method to Develop Literature Searches. So the Bramer approach suggests you need to start by determining a clear and focused question. You need to describe articles that can answer the question. You can decide which key concepts address the different elements of the question and decide which elements should be used for the best results that you can answer the question with. You need to choose appropriate databases and interfaces and document the search process. Subsequently, you should use the thesaurus in the first database that you've chosen and identify index terms in there, and then use the thesaurus to identify synonyms, add in variations of those search terms, and then use a database appropriate syntax with parentheses and Boolean operators and field codes to generate the search. You need then to go through that search and optimize it and evaluate the initial results, check the results for errors, and then translate to other databases. And when you've got those results, then you look within those results for the papers that would answer the question. And if you found those, that's fine. And if you haven't, you iterate the results. Now, if you were already trained in literature searching, that would seem like an efficient approach. But this is beyond the scope of this review to train you in, for example, all the field codes for all the portals and databases that we might use. And certainly it's beyond us to develop expertise in medical subject headings. So we need a different approach, one that's even more efficient than this one. In terms of the first page of those steps that I showed you, in terms of determining a clear and focused question, well, we started with a title. In terms of articles that can answer that question, well, I know your supervisor has some already, so you can speak to your supervisor about that. In terms of the key concepts that address the different elements of the question, well, you've already broken down the elements of the question into their PICOS elements, and you've labeled the elements according to PICOS. And now it's a case of deciding which of those PICOS elements you need to include in a search. For example, it may not always be appropriate to include the comparator. You then need to choose an appropriate database and interface to start with. Well, I'm specifying that for you. We're going to use Central, and then we're going to use Ovid Medline, Embase, and PsycInfo. We may also use Web of Science and CENTRAL if we've got time. We need to document the search process in a text document where you already started recording what you found, and I'm going to give you some more guidance on that. And you search for overlapping reviews to identify where you can use elements of searches they've already got. So that's what we're going to do this week. We're going to use search elements from papers with overlapping PICOS elements. We can use those modular components in our search, and then we're going to evaluate those initial results, and we're going to do that using publications that our supervisors give us. We're going to check for errors. Well, we're going to do that today using some guidelines called the PRESS guidelines, and then we can start working towards, over the next week, testing and iterating our results. So I think there's some information that you do need to make a start on kind of adding the components together. And the first thing you need to think about is Boolean logic. So what we're going to look at is and, not, or, and ors. So and narrows the search results because you need two things to be present. So it's necessarily a subset of those search terms are going to overlap. And so and narrows our search results. Not excludes, so not gets rid of elements that we don't want an overlap with. or expand, so it says you can have one thing or the other, and anding two sets of ors, so spirometry or exacerbations and bronchiectasis or cystic fibrosis. Anding those two things together makes a narrower result than the two or sections separately, so the two parentheses separately. I should mention there is a really useful wiki that contains lots of different truncation, wildcard symbols and search operators for lots of different portals and databases, and I'm going to put a link to it in the general chat. So we're just going to watch a brief video now around medical subject headings, and you'll see a lot of these in the search components in the overlapping reviews you're going to take those components from.
MESH stands for Medical Subject Headings, and it's a set of controlled vocabulary used for indexing PubMed citations. In order to explain how MESH works, let's take a minute to consider the hashtag. Hashtags are used on social media websites, like Twitter and Instagram, to identify messages on a specific topic and to give context to a post. I found this picture of the Pillsbury Doughboy float on Instagram. From the picture and the caption, I can see that this was taken at the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade. The hashtags tell me more information about the picture, such as where it was taken, other floats in the parade, and the camera and photo editing software that was used. While this picture is worth 1,000 words, the hashtags provide more context about the picture. MESH terms are used to give better context to the articles in PubMed Medline. When searching PubMed, you are searching the article citation information in the abstract of the article, not the full text. An abstract should be a summary of all the important information in an article, but an abstract has a limited word count and can't contain all the topics from the article. MESH terms should let you know about any other therapies, diagnostic tests, diseases, information about the article's subjects, and themes that are discussed in the article, whether or not they appear in the abstract. Here are a few things to note about MESH. MESH provides a consistent way to describe topics. For instance, authors are not always consistent with disease or drug names. One example is Crohn's disease. A MESH term of Crohn's disease can be used to search for various spelling variations or different names for this disease. Also, certain themes may be expressed in an article that may be hard to describe with keyword searching. For instance, an author may write an article that contains the theme of unnecessary procedures without having used these words in the article. Tagging an article with the MESH heading unnecessary procedures lets us search on this theme. MESH uses a hierarchical structure that permits searching at various levels of specificity. For instance, the MESH term otitis falls under ear diseases, and there are more specific cases of otitis inflammation listed underneath. When I search the term otitis, I'm not only searching articles tagged with this subject heading, I'm also searching articles tagged with more specific subject headings. MESH terms are applied by subject specialists, or people, who scan the articles to determine the best subject headings to apply to it. We rely on librarians and subject specialists to apply MESH terms because of the subtleties of language. For instance, a software program may not be able to tell the difference between a tear or a tier. Also, it may be tricky for a software program to understand an abstract theme of an article. Because MESH terms are applied by people, there's a bit of a lag between when an article shows up in PubMed and when the MESH terms are applied. Articles that are tagged with MESH terms are considered to be indexed for Medline. The newest articles in PubMed may not yet be indexed for Medline. I'm going to finish with 3 tips on how to identify MESH terms. First, you can find a relevant article that has been indexed for Medline and see what terms it has been tagged with. If you find relevant articles in Google Scholar or another database, search for that article in PubMed and look at its MESH terms. You can also search the MESH database directly. Switch from PubMed to MESH and search for your terms. When you search within the MESH database, you can see the MESH records, and this includes a definition of the term, and it shows the hierarchy. Finally, view your search details to see how PubMed mapped your search terms. Search details show up on the right side of the screen when you are using the most recent sort. When PubMed processes your search, it does its best to map your search terms to a relevant mesh heading. If a heading is found, PubMed will not only search on your keywords, it will also search the mesh terms. To learn more about mesh, I recommend reviewing the National Library of Medicine's mesh tutorial. Find it by searching Mesh Tutorial NLM.
I'm not going to read through these, but these are some of the search operators for Ovid Medline. And I think the key thing is to make use of the guides to the different databases that contain these. So I'll put a couple of these in the general chat for you guys to make use of. But the key thing to bear in mind is that PubMed and Ovid Medline aren't exactly the same. Ovid Medline and Ovid PsycInfo aren't exactly the same. And Central is different again. So it's just one of those things where you have to be ready to go and look at the guides to make sure that you understand what the terms mean. And the other thing to just notice is how careful you need to be with the syntax, because if you get the syntax wrong, you won't be repeating the result precisely. And it also speaks to how carefully you have to note down your search terms, because otherwise people won't be able to replicate them, and we'll discuss that some more momentarily. So now on to the worked examples. So I'm going to go through the searches for exercise therapy for bronchiectasis, and I'm going to go through them in Central and in Ovid Medline and Ovid Embase, and I'll show you what they're like from the Cochrane review for exercise therapy for bronchiectasis. And I'm going to then add in a spirometry search from elsewhere to each of those in turn. So this is me kind of going through and explaining how the searches work for each one. So you can see here, I've coloured the population, in my case bronchiectasis, in pink, the intervention, in my case exercise, in red. I'm not interested in comparator. The outcome I'm interested in is spirometry, but it's not in the searches we're going to look at initially. And then the study design is blue. That's not going to be in Central because Central has only RCTs, but it will be in Medline and Embase. This is, as I said, from exercise training for bronchiectasis in the Cochrane database of systematic reviews from 2021. So line 1, bronch colon misc. This means that they searched for the bronch tag in the specialist register for the airways group. Now, we can't access the specialist register directly because we're not doing a Cochrane review as part of the airways group. But the Cochrane review groups publish the trials that they find into Central and they tag them. So the way round that is I search for bronch wildcard and I limit the search by hitting the limit button in the advanced search page to Cochrane groups, and then I type in airways, and then it limits the searches to that bronch wildcard in trials in Central that have been tagged by the Cochrane airways group. The second line relates to medical subject heading, so it looks for the medical subject heading bronchiectasis, and then you remember medical subject headings are a tree, and it's saying explode it, so I get all the subject headings beneath that. If I didn't explode it, I would just get that one line. Third line is a wildcard search for bronchiect wildcard, and then line 4 joins them all up with an OR, so it's saying I'm taking line 1, 2, or 3. So for intervention, the intervention I'm interested in is exercise, and in this case, it's they look at the mesh headings for rehabilitation, which they explode, respiratory therapy, which they explode, exercise, which they explode, physical therapy modalities, which they explode, and then they do wildcard searches for rehabilitation, fitness, exercise, train, or physiotherapy, or physical next to therapy. And then line 10 says I'll take any of those, so it joins them with an or. Okay, and then lastly it says to and line 4 and line 10, so it's saying that it'll take any of the pink lines as long as any of the red lines are there as well. So that's the narrowing. It was, it was a very broad approach to the population and a broad approach to the intervention, but then it narrows it by saying that they both have to be present for us to be interested. Okay, looking now at Medline. So the first line is a medical subject heading, and it's just bronchiectasis, and you can see here that's exploded as well. And then the second line is a wildcard search in title and abstract for bronchiect, and then line 3 is saying 1 or 2. In terms of the intervention, we're exploding physical therapy modalities, we're exploding exercise and physical fitness. We're not exploding physical exertion, we're just taking that line of the medical subject heading. We're exploding physical therapy. And then we're taking a series of words that we're doing title and abstract searches on, and we're saying we'll have any of those. Same with aerobics. And then we're saying muscle, as long as it's within 3 words of resistance in the title abstract, we're interested in that. And in line 12, we're saying we'll have any of those. Medline, unlike Central, isn't restricted to randomized control trials. So this is a randomized control trial search, and it's mainly straightforward down to line 21. So it gets confusing at line 22. And if you look at that carefully, the way you can see is line 22 is animals, line 23 is humans. Line 24 is saying, I'm interested in animals, not humans and animals. And then 5 is saying not 24. And so I think that works out by saying that we're interested in studies as long as they include humans, even if they include animals. So it's a kind of not. And then line 13 joins population to intervention, and line 26 joins the population and intervention line with the study design line. Still don't have the outcome. And lastly, here's Embase, and we've got exploding bronchiectasis and a wildcard search of title and abstract, and then joining those 2 with an or. And then we're exploding the medical subject heading for physical therapy modalities, again exploding exercise and physical fitness. We're not exploding exertion, we're exploding exercise therapy. We're combining these wildcard searches for these series of words, and then we're looking for muscle adjacent to resistance in title and abstract, and we're oring them. And then we've got a series of searches for study type, and they're fairly straightforward down to line 28, when again it's the only looking for studies that include humans aspect. And then that's the bit that joins the section that was population with intervention, and then the population and intervention line with the study design. So I still want spirometry, and so I've gone and got another Cochrane review, which is extensive spirometry for the prevention of post-operative pulmonary complications in upper abdominal surgery. And I'm not actually interested in incentive spirometry, I'm just interested in spirometry. So I'm going to take the spirometry element out of the incentive spirometry search. So you can see here in line 2, they've got incentive near to spirometry, and then they've got a spirometry title and abstract search. And all I'm doing is taking that spirometry section there. And I took that initially from the central search, and I'm also taking it from the Medline search, and I'm also taking it from the Embase search. And then I'm joining it up and fixing the numbers, because in the different searches, they've got different relationships between the lines, and I need to fix it so the line relationships work. So this is the search from Central, and it previously ended at line 10. I've now added line 11, where I've added in the spirometer search. So it's a all field search plus a title and abstract search, which is kind of redundant. I could have done just the first one, or I could have done just the first one. And then I've joined line 11 up with line 4 and 10. Oh, that's a mistake. And that's how I've kind of combined the elements. So now I'm going to just describe to you how to access Ovid, and Ovid Medline in particular. But I'm also going to show you a video afterwards which demonstrates it. So I'm just going to talk through this slowly, and then you're going to see me do it in practice. So first of all, open up your browser and navigate to library.leeds.ac.uk. And from memory, up in the top left, you need to click Search Help, and then it opens up and you can see the link to databases on the sidebar. And you click on databases, and then you scroll to Ovid and click that, and then click Medline, and you'll go into Medline. And then you need to log in, and then you can see there's a series of databases to choose from again. Scroll down to the bottom and click Ovid Medline All, and then click OK. Just double check that you are logged in, because when you're going to want to save these searches, and you save them and they then appear in your workspace under My Searches and Alert. Now we're jumping ahead to how we extract, and again I'm going to show you this in practice. So you've run your searches in Ovid Medline and you've got some results, and you select the results you want to export. Now, in our case, we're always going to want to export them all. And if there's less than 1,000, then you can select by range, and you can just go 1 to 999 or however many there are. In my case, often there's very few. So in the example I'm going to give, I think there's 21 or 23. So I just change the amount I can see on one page and check the select all. But the select all doesn't seem to work if it goes beyond one page. So in which case you're going to have to select a range. You then select export on the bar above the main list of results, and then you'll get the option to export to, and you want to choose citation and abstract. I actually now just select all. And then you click export citation. If you're using desktop EndNote, it will ask you to choose an import filter to select it, in which case you choose Medline Ovid. But the example I'm going to show today is that of us using Endnote Web. So in that case, you can ignore line 6. It's saved or it's dropped a file into your wherever your downloads are. Okay, so just trust that that's there. Save the results in Medline, and we're going to now use the browser or another browser tab to go to myendnote.com. If you are on campus, you'll automatically, if you use your Leeds account, get 5 GB of storage. If you're off campus, the way to make sure you get 5 GB of storage on myendnote.com is to log in through Windows Virtual Desktop, and then in the virtual desktop, use your browser there and register there. Okay, today we're going to log into the library, navigate to Ovid and log into Medline, and we're going to run the searches that we prepared earlier in Ovid Medline, and then we're going to export those, and then we're going to import them to my Endnote Web. Okay, so I'm on the university library page, and I'm going to go to Search Help. Okay, and then when I'm in there, I'm going to go to databases. And now I'm going to choose Ovid. And now I'm going to scroll down and I'm going to choose Medline. And I'm going to click Medline again. I'm going to scroll down so I can see Ovid Medline all. I'm going to check it and click OK. And now you can see we're automatically in advanced search. And so we can start entering our search terms in there. And fortunately, I've got one I've already entered here. So I entered line by line, checking as I went. When I combined them, I used the, I'll give you an example. This and that. Okay. Combine them both and I added them or ordered them with the buttons rather than typing them in. Okay. So let's assume I've done a large search. I've got my search history here and I'm going to collect all of them and I'm going to save them all. Okay, now I've already done this, but you're going to want to give it a name and save it as permanent so that it stays in your workspace. Okay. So when you want to come back later after you've saved it, it will be there as a permanent search that you can run again. So you can hit View and select it and hit Run. And it executes the search. And you can view the search. Okay. So let's assume you've typed all this in and you want to see your results. And they're here. Okay. Now, the easiest way to do it, assuming it's not too big, is, and if it is really big, you can export 1,000 at a time using the range. So 1 to 999. I don't have that many. I've only got 21. So instead, I'm going to go 100 per page, scroll to the top, select all, hit export, and this is important. The format you want to export it in is Endnote, okay? And you're exporting the complete reference, okay? Hit export, and it exports as ovidweb.ovd, and you can see I've already practiced that here. Now, the next thing you're going to do is go to myendnoteweb.com, or I think the link on the slide is to my.endnote.com, but they both end up in the same place. And what you want to do, and you can see I've already done it here, is go to Collect and Import References. And then you want to go to Choose File, select your reference, import option, you want to choose PubMed NLM, and I'm going to import it into a new group because I've already done it, and hit import. It then asks me what name I want to give it. I'm going to call it Practice. And you'll see it's imported 21 references. And if we go into the search, we'll see there was 21 references. So that's how you get to Ovid Medline, run searches, export those searches and import them into my Endnote Web, and I want you to do that into separate groups for Medline and for Central. Okay, I'll show you Central in a moment. So that was the search on Central with the export to Endnote. And now we're going to do the same in Central. So here's the search that I'm using in Central, and you can see I've added spirometry. Okay, so you can see here I've got the search for Central that I put together with the spirometry addition. So you remember I mentioned that you had to adapt the search that used the term you remember I said you had to adapt this term that used the search MISC1, and I have done that here. Now, unfortunately, I ran all this search and recorded it and had my mic muted, and I honestly can't bear to go through every step of this again. So I'm just going to show you the ones that are tricky. So the two that are tricky are where I've had to limit it to a Cochrane group and where I've had to use mesh. So I'm just going to run those ones again just so you can see them, and then I'll show you how to export. Okay. So I'm going to show you how I did the Bronx search. So the first thing I did was hit limit. Oops. So the first thing I did was hit limits, and you can see here I've got the choice to choose Cochrane group. Now I had to search to see what MISC1 referred to, and it refers to the Airways group. So I'm going to put Airways in here, and as I start to type, it pops up, and I can apply limits. Okay, so now it's limited to Airways group, and the term was bronch, and I'm just going to add a wildcard to it, and then it should find all the bronch tagged items in the Airways specialist register. Okay, just check that I've done that right. No, because I spelt it wrong. Okay, undo. Okay, same number. Brilliant. Okay, the next thing we want to do is search for the mesh tagged items. So I'm going to click mesh, and then I get to choose. So I'll use as an example bronchiectasis. So I start to type bronchiectasis in here. And there's bronchiectasis, right? And then I have to press lookup. Now, you remember this term was exploded in the search, so I'm going to leave it exploded. Sometimes they aren't exploded, in which case you just use the single term. So I am going to add that search line, and there it is. 359, the same as up here, 359. Okay. So I'm just going to remove those ones that I didn't want. So remove that line and remove that line. Okay, so we're back where we were. Okay, so I'm going to click my 272 and show it. Okay, and you'll see it comes up with 13 Cochrane reviews and 259 trials. Let's do the trials first. So there's my 259 trials. I select all, and I hit export selected citations. And then I choose RIS format, and it doesn't seem to particularly matter which version you choose, but we're going to choose RIS EndNote. We're going to click include abstract and hit download. Okay, So that downloaded, and that's citation export, open brackets to close brackets .ris. So I'm going to go into Endnote. I'm going to choose that file. I'm going to import it using refmanris, and I'm going to send it to a new group and hit import. And I'm just going to call that test trials because I've already done this once. And we'll just check and see we got the right amount. Okay, 259 references were imported into the test trials group. So you can see that there. Okay. So, and we'll just double check that that was the right amount, and 259 citations, that was the correct amount. And you'll want to do that again for the Cochrane reviews, and I suggest putting it in a separate group. And the reason you want to download those as well is that those reviews may contain references that you will want to include in your review. Okay? Okay, so we've seen how to run searches on Ovid, PubMed, and on Central and export them both to Endnote. And I'm going to go into some more detail on considerations on the searches and how to report them. So searches for systematic reviews aim to be as extensive as possible in order to ensure as many as possible of the necessary and relevant studies are included in the review. However, it's necessary to strike a balance between sensitivity, so striving for comprehensiveness, and precision, maintaining relevance. In other words, ensuring that it's feasible to go through the results without having to spend all your time clearing out irrelevant studies. Increasing the comprehensiveness or sensitivity of a search will reduce precision and retrieve more non-relevant articles. Sensitivity is defined as the number of relevant reports identified divided by the total number of relevant reports in existence, whereas precision is described or defined as the number of relevant reports identified divided by the total number of reports identified. Developing a search strategy is an iterative process in which the terms that are used are modified based on what has been retrieved. There are diminishing returns for search efforts. After a certain stage, each additional unit of time invested in searching returns fewer references that are relevant to the review. So consequently, there comes a point where the rewards of further searching might not be worth the effort required to identify the additional references. The decision as to how much to invest in the search process depends on the question that a review addresses or the resources that are available. It should be noted, however, that article abstracts identified through a literature search can be scan-read very quickly to ascertain potential relevance. At a conservatively estimated reading rate of 2 abstracts a minute, the results of a database search can be scan-read at 120 records per hour, or approximately 1,000 over an 8-hour period. So the high yield and low precision associated with a systematic review search is not as daunting as it might first appear, in comparison with the total time to be invested in a review. I should say what's being referred to there is specifically the title and abstract screening, not the full text screening. The field of testing search strategies is a complex one and draws on a number of methodologies that this course can't support. In the case of Cochrane reviews, they're made much easier by having specialist registers that the searches can be tested against, and we don't have those. So in our case, we're going to use the supervisor, and we're going to ask them to give their expert view on what papers we should find and test our searches against those papers. So there's recently been released the PRISMA-S reporting guidelines, which are an extension to the PRISMA statement, which is a set of reporting guidelines for systematic reviews as a whole. Incomplete reporting of literature search methods can introduce doubt and diminish trust in the final systematic review conclusions. If researchers, meaning the readers, are unable to understand or reproduce how information was gathered for a systematic review, they may suspect the authors of having introduced bias into their review by not conducting a thorough or pre-specified literature search. This is the PRISMA-S checklist, and it represents the kind of guide as to what we need to report. So we need to report the database name, so name each individual database search, stating which platform. So we're using Ovid today, but we may use EBSCOhost for one of the databases next week. If we're doing a multi-database search, we'd need to state which databases were searched simultaneously. So you saw that when we logged into Ovid, we could select Medline and PsycInfo and Embase simultaneously. I tend not to do that because it makes it harder to report or to identify if there's a problem in the searches. Also, it makes it difficult to use syntax because the different databases may not be compatible. We have to describe any study registries that we've made use of. So in the case of the search that I was using, I was making use of the tagging done by the Cochrane Airways group. We need to be clear about any browsing that we've done. So if there's any online resources that we've used, we need to be clear about that. That's not really going to be something we're going to do in this course. In terms of citation searching, if we've gone through citations in papers that we found, we need to be clear about that. So in the case of when we use the Cochrane library, if we retrieve other reviews and search through their reference lists in those reviews, we need to be clear about this. If we've contacted anybody to seek extra studies, we need to be clear about that. And if we've used any other methods, we need to be clear about that as well. We need to report the full search strategy exactly as they were run. So include the full search strategy for each database and fully copy and paste that. We need to fully describe any limits or restrictions that we used in the searches and provide justification for their use. If we use search filters, we need to describe those and describe whether we used them as originally designed or whether we modified them, and we need to cite them if we've got a source. If we've used prior work, so we've used strategies from other literature reviews that we've either used verbatim or adapted, we need to cite those reviews. And if we're updating searches or rerunning them repeatedly, we need to be clear about that with our dates that we ran them initially and when we updated them. Okay, the next item in the PRISMA-S checklist is that we should describe any peer review process we did on our search strategy. So did somebody else check our search strategy? And in our case, we don't have anybody else to do it. So we're going to do each other's. I'm going to describe how we're going to do that in a minute. In terms of how we manage our records, we're going to document the total number of records identified from each database. So this is kind of why I didn't like the idea of searching multiple databases simultaneously. We want to record separately where how many results we got from each database. So how many from Medline, how many from Central, how many from PsycInfo, how many from Embase, potentially how many from CENTRAL or Web of Knowledge. And then finally, deduplication. So how did we deduplicate? So as you may guess, different databases may contain the same paper, and we have to get rid of those repeated records. Now, Endnote, which we've looked at briefly, has the ability to deduplicate in it. Endnote Web itself, I don't believe does, but the Apps Anywhere version that we can use through remote desktop and the desktop version, which if you're in a computer lab on campus, you'll have access to, has really quite powerful deduplication. These are the press guidelines for peer review for search strategies. And they're actually targeted at medical librarians, because medical librarians are the information specialists that support systematic review. And we don't have enough resource to have information specialists for each of you guys. And so we're going to do peer review. And it's a fairly straightforward checklist, with the exception of the expertise required to do the medical subject heading components. So what I'm suggesting is we do all of the checklist except the medical subject heading component. Okay, the first section is about translation of the research question. So it's a case of checking, does the search strategy match the research question and PICO, and are the search concepts clear? So you saw when I did it, I highlighted mine in particular colors to make that really obvious. And I suggest that as review teams, you do that. In terms of if there are too many or few PICO elements included, well, in my case, I didn't need to specify the comparator. And when it came to Central, I didn't need to specify the study design. But it may have been the case that I hadn't specified the study design, but I was only interested in randomized control trials. And if I'd left that out, that would have been a mistake. Are the concepts too narrow or too broad? And that really depends on the extent to which you can use elements really easily from existing reviews, given that we're building on those. And it's a case of just making sure that the match between the components that you use and your question really works. So you saw when I was searching for spirometry, I was actually borrowing components from incentive spirometry. I just left the incentive components out. Does the search retrieve too many or too few records? And this is why we need to record per line, because if there's any mistakes in there, it's quite easy to see, because if the search isn't pulling up a sensible number of papers, you'll know that something's gone wrong. And are there any unconventional or complex strategies in the search, and can they be explained? Like that search you saw around animal studies and human animal studies from the study design filter that I used. So to be clear, we should be able to explain our search strategy, and we should do that, and then our peer reviewers should be able to read our explanations and understand them. Okay, in terms of the logic used, are they used correctly? Is the nesting with brackets appropriate and effective? So are we using those correctly, or are there kind of spare brackets floating around? Is the word not used? Is the operator not used? And is it being used appropriately? So might there be any unintended exclusions? Now, I'm slightly hesitant about recommending the use of proximity operators. I think they're something that we should use sparingly, because you need to be really careful about how you use them. But in some cases, they can be used, and they can make the increase the precision of a search. So if we are using those, are they being used well? And is the width of them, so is adjacent 2 or adjacent 5 or adjacent 3 correctly? So is the number of words apart that the words have to be sensibly specified? Broadly, the point of this section is to review the search for instances where mistakes might have occurred in the Boolean operators. So where or might have been used instead of and, or vice versa. And has and been used appropriately to link phrases or words? And in terms of the text word searching, so the kind of title and abstract or multiple all field searches, have we used all the correct spelling variants? So have we used the US and the UK spelling? Have we used all synonyms and antonyms? So if there's a concept we're looking for, have we searched for the opposite in case that there are searches that are kind of exploring that might be relevant for us? Have we done truncation correctly? Is it too broad or too narrow? Are all acronyms and abbreviations used appropriately? Are they capturing relevant or irrelevant material? Are full terms also included as well as abbreviations? Are the keywords specific enough or too broad? Have the appropriate fields been searched? So are we searching the text word fields or all fields? Are these the correct search limits to use? Search operators to use? Are there other fields to be included or excluded? And these will vary by database. Are there any particularly complex long strings that should be broken into shorter statements? In terms of spelling, syntax, and line numbers, are there any spelling errors? Are there any errors in the system syntax? So, for example, are we using the correct truncation symbol for each database? Are there any incorrect line combinations or lines that aren't referred to later on? So you saw that I had to change the line number in my joining statement where I'd made a mistake. Sometimes you find that you've actually ended up leaving lines out by mistake, and that needs to be checked. Overall, we just need to review the search strategy for misspelled words and for errors in the system syntax that can't be found by spell checking. And we need to check our line numbers and combinations of line numbers to make sure we've correctly implemented the logic. In terms of the search limits and the filters, are they appropriate and relevant given our research question? And are they appropriate for the database that we're searching? Are we missing any potentially helpful limits or filters? Are the limits or filters too broad or too narrow? Can any limits be taken away or added? If we've used filters, have we cited the sources for them? Okay, so that was the press checklist. And I just want to check before we kind of move on to what we're going to do over the next week. Hopefully by now, you should have discussed your PICOs with your supervisor, checked that you found the reviews that the supervisor expected to see, and you've collected those relevant reviews. So you're ready to make use of those today. All right, bye. See you in a minute.